Yeah, so you're thinking of the contingency argument as, I would say, a kind of skeleton that can provide a backbone for other arguments. We've got lots of different evidence here that kind of points to one conclusion. There's a kind of mind at the foundation of reality that can explain the rest of the things that we see in a very deep way.
Wow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we have a renowned guest for all of you. Today's guest is going to be Joshua Rasmussen, who is a philosopher specializing in metaphysics and philosophy of religion. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame and is also a professor at Azusa Pacific University. His work explores fundamental questions about existence, contingency, and the nature of God, often engaging with both theistic and atheistic perspectives. What makes Dr. Rasmussen's journey particularly compelling is that he hasn't merely inherited a belief system, he has critically examined and reconstructed his worldview step by step. His sincere and rigorous pursuit of truth, coupled with a rare depth of empathy, makes his insight especially valuable. So I am honored to have such a renowned guest on our platform. How are you doing, Doctor?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So the first thing that I want to talk about is your journey, because that is very insightful when it comes to what you went through. So my first question would be, how did your early philosophical journey unfold, and what initially drove you towards questioning the fundamental nature of existence?
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like I've always been curious. One of my earliest memories was talking with my mom about how high the numbers go. I was very curious, like, what's the highest number? And I remember she said, you should go ask Dad. So I went and talked with my dad, and he said, well, the numbers go up forever and ever and ever. And it's like, what? Does that make sense? And I was like thinking about, how could there be an infinity? And so I was always sort of curious to understand, like, what is this reality that we find ourselves in? I remember being at school one time, and this is kind of crazy, but I was wondering, like, how do I actually know that my classmates have the same kind of first person experience, either the feeling of being me that I have? How do I really know that? And I was just wondering about, like, how do you know those things, right? Then when I began to discover this world called philosophy, I didn't know what it was, but I discovered other people were interested in understanding things, not just taking assumptions for granted. And so for me, one of the big questions that came up was what we're going to talk about today, which has to do with the nature of fundamental reality. Is the fundamental nature of existence something that is encouraging to us, or is it instead something that is fundamentally maybe discouraging? It's fundamentally mindless and meaningless. And so this relates to the question of God's existence. And so this question became kind of the question that got me deeper into the world of philosophy. Began to read books, investigate science relevant to how our universe was formed. And this really sparked kind of, I would say, an awareness that there is this world where people are thinking about these things on a deep level. Because I didn't really know that. I mean, I just thought, well, there are beliefs, you inherit them. You don't question those beliefs. But if you do question those beliefs, well, who do you turn to? That's where I discovered the philosophers.
Right. And then you have this fascinating image on your X you generally use, which is the light of reason. And, you have this, people can see on the screen. So is in your journey, was the light of reason that guided you towards the fundamental reality?
Yeah, I discovered that you can think about these things by a light in your own mind. So, like, how do you know that if you take two apples and you put two more apples together and you're on Mars, you're on the planet Mars, okay, and you do this, how do you know you'll end up with four apples, right? Like, maybe you only get 2 + 2 = 4 on Earth, but if you go to Mars, 2 + 2 might equal 75. How do you know? And I say, well, you don't have to go to Mars to know. You can actually know from the Earth that if you take two apples and you're on the planet Mars and you add two more apples, that will still be 4 apples, even on Mars. And you can see this by the light of reason. This is one of these familiar lights that we all have, that we can use to see certain truths that apply anywhere in any place. Like no matter where you go, 2 plus 2 will equal 4. And no matter where you go, there are other principles that you can see by the light of reason that are relevant to this question that I'm talking about today, about the nature of reality. Like just one kind of preview is that you can know that the total of everything includes everything, and therefore there's nothing outside all things. This is something you can know by reason, because it's a contradiction for there to be something outside all that is. And so reason reveals these things. And I began to discover this when I began to study philosophy in more depth, that philosophers are using reason. I think a lot of times people have this impression that philosophers spin webs of reason untethered from actual reality. But actually, you can know some things about actual reality if you use reason carefully. You can actually follow these lines in your mind. The key is to be careful and not just to actually make a guess that you don't see. There's a difference between not seeing and actually seeing that 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can do that, and then you can know anywhere in reality, here's what I predict. If I take 2 apples and add 2 more, I'm going to get to 4. That's an important prediction. And you don't have to wait till you actually add up the numbers to, on Mars to know what that prediction is going to be. You can see it right in your mind right away. So this is a very important tool that we can use.
Right. And just before we go deeper into it, one question comes to my mind, or one comment, which is some people still think that, this wouldn't work outside the universe. Is like, I think they conflate metaphysics with physics in the sense. We have anything to say about that?
So there is this worry sometimes that we can use certain instruments to know what's true about our universe. And this is based on maybe empirical science, where we investigate how many particles our universe contains, or how big is our universe. What's the average mass approximately? And so there are these, you might call them physical laws, that we can discover. But then there's this further question about whether you can discover rules or laws of reality that aren't dependent on the details of this universe. You talked about like metaphysics dealing with the natures of things. And I think that we don't have to limit ourselves to this universe to see that 2 plus 2 would equal 4 in any possible universe. Now, we could talk about other worlds where there's different rules of mathematics, and we could investigate whether that's a conceptual possibility. But even if you do that, you're still going to be using reason to investigate those other worlds. You're going to be using reason to make deductions that, for example, if A is true, and if A being true implies B is true, then B is true. That's a principle of logic. That's modus ponens. So we call that, and it's just an inference rule that you could see by reason, and that applies across every physical universe. So yeah, I think reason's a very powerful tool. I think we underestimate its power, because you can use it not just to investigate, how the numbers on the different planets in our universe, but you can investigate the logic across all universes.
Yeah, interesting. So maybe that's like a good introduction or summary about what we're gonna go deep into. So now the topic of discussion is the contingency argument. And many people get confused with the contingency argument. They think they don't know the core structure, or they conflate it. So can you very briefly explain what the contingency argument is?
So this is a tool to investigate the nature of reality. And many philosophers would divide the argument into 2 parts or 2 stages. So the first part is devoted to uncovering a foundational element of reality that exists independent of other things, and it has a kind of robust existence. It can't be created, it can't be destroyed. It has what philosophers sometimes call necessary existence. So the first part of the argument, the first stage, is an argument for this foundational reality that has necessary existence. And then the second stage of the argument seeks to identify the nature of this necessary foundational reality. So in the first stage, we try to explain the dependent things like cups and chairs and planets, in terms of something that's not itself dependent, something foundational. Then the second stage seeks to uncover, well, what kind of thing could be foundational? And the argument there is that the only thing that could be foundational is some kind of supreme reality, something that's not arbitrarily limited or bounded like a turtle, but something that's unbounded, pure, and complete. I've made the argument that it has a perfect nature that allows it to be foundational. So those are the two parts, and together they seek to show that there is a foundational reality that you might call God.
Okay. Yeah, so that was a good summary. So, like, can we just go with the definitions first? Because many people might get confused with what do we mean by contingency? What do we mean by necessary?
Yeah, so in order to understand this argument, we have to define the key terms, right? So it's a contingency argument, an argument from contingency. And let me back up and say something more general about arguments of this general type. So there's a general class of arguments called cosmological arguments. These are arguments from the causal or explanatory structure of reality. They seek to show that some things are caused, but there's a foundation that's uncaused. Some things that are explained by something else, and there's a foundation that's unexplained. And this general type of argument comes in different forms. And the different forms are different based on which things you focus on, which things are in the scope of things that have a cause. So, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument focuses on things that begin to exist. So that's an argument that things that begin to exist have some cause. The argument from contingency focuses on contingent things. And I'll define what these are in a moment, but just that these are things that have a certain kind of nature. Even if they don't begin to exist, if they're contingent, they still have to depend on something prior. To illustrate the concept of a contingent thing, I brought this block here. So this is a blue bit of reality, okay? And you might wonder how this blue bit of reality got here. Like, why does this exist, right? Presumably, it's not an eternal reality. It's the kind of thing that can come to be or cease to be. And more specifically, and relevant to our discussion, is that this is a contingent thing. It's a contingent object. That means that its existence can fail. It doesn't have to be included within reality. There's a possible, logically consistent reality where this thing doesn't exist. For example, before it existed, it didn't exist. We can imagine a world where it never exists. There's nothing sort of metaphysically necessary about this thing's existence. And for purposes of our argument, or for our time together, I like to use a notion of possibility that's very minimalistic. It's not just physical possibility, it's just mere logical possibility. And by this, I mean that there's no logically necessary truth that precludes it. Where a logically necessary truth is some kind of truth that you can discern to be true just by thinking through reason, just through the light of reason. So I'm thinking of a logically necessary truth, something that could in principle be known through reasoning, through the light of reason. And then it's possible, something's possible if reason doesn't rule out its possibility. Okay, doesn't contradict anything that you could see through reason. And so the idea then is that this object here could possibly not exist. In fact, we know that it could possibly not exist because there was a time when it didn't exist. I guess none of you have seen the non-existence of this thing, but you've had other experiences with similar things, so you can infer probably this thing could possibly not exist. So that's what a contingent reality is. It's something that could possibly, consistent with reason, not exist.
Okay, so that was a very nice definition. One thing maybe very briefly, if you can add, which is in these discussions, it has no bearing on science. No matter what science can discover, it is like, it cannot even address these avenues. Is that correct?
It is sort of foundational and prior to science, at least on the usual understanding of science as an investigation into the natural world through empirical instruments. The idea here is that in order to do science, there are some principles of logic that are bedrock to science itself. We talked about reason, for example. Part of science involves making deductions, predictions from hypotheses. So if you have some hypothesis, you could tease out using reason a prediction. That hypothesis implies certain things. Then you go and test the hypothesis, making observations. Well, in order to even do that, you need logic, right? Like, it can't be that whatever's true is also not true, because then if you verified that a hypothesis is true, you haven't guaranteed that it isn't also not true, right? So you need logic in order to do science. And so, and that's what I'm using for this argument is logic. So this argument doesn't depend on our particular scientific theories through empirical observation. It really depends on logic, which is foundational itself to science. So yeah, it doesn't depend on science, but maybe science depends on the kind of, at least the core use of logic, which I'm using in this argument.
Okay. So I think we covered most of what the background we had to cover. Now we can dive nicely into the argument. So you mentioned there were two stages to this argument. So what is the first stage?
Yeah, so the first stage again is arguing for some foundational reality that exists in a robust way. Its non-existence is not a real possibility. It has a kind of necessity to it. So the idea is that if you really understand its nature, you can see even by reason that its non-existence would imply a contradiction. But we don't use just pure reason to deduce that there is this kind of necessary reality, although we might attempt to do that. The argument for contingency takes another path. The argument is that in order to explain all of the contingent parts of reality, we need something beyond the contingent reality to provide some kind of cause or support for its existence. This is going to lead us to the result that there's got to be something that is transcendent to the contingent parts of reality, something that has a different nature, something that has necessary existence. So again, that's the outline of the argument, and you can divide it, this first stage of the argument, into, I would say, 2 steps. Well, let's say 3 steps. So the first step is just the observation that something exists. Something exists. Okay. And then you can start wondering, well, how is it that there's anything, right? Like why does anything exist? And then this first step that something exists will lead us then to these next 2 steps. So the next step, we'll call this step 2, is the principle of cause and effect. This is the principle that any contingent reality, whether it's a small reality or a large reality, whether it's blue or green, whether it's shaped like a turtle or shaped like your nose, it doesn't matter what it is, what it's made out of, what color it is, what shape it is, as long as it's a contingent reality. Then, given both reason and experience and science, we have evidence, very good evidence, that it comes from something. It has to have some deeper explanation. It doesn't just exist completely uncaused. There's an order to things. We don't just randomly see blue objects come into being or go out of being. There's a structural order, and we can understand the structural order in terms of cause and effect. So contingent realities of any size, of any quantity, have some cause. So that's the causal step. So we've got the causal step. So the first step is that something exists. The second step is that contingent things have some cause. And then the third step is the logic step that deduces from a cause of contingent things something that's not itself contingent. Now, it's important to emphasize here that I'm making no assumptions at all about how many contingent things there are, whether there's one contingent thing or 1,000 or even infinitely many contingent things. The idea is that the whole realm of contingent things itself, or themselves, if we're talking about the many, don't just exist on their own. There's some prior condition. You never see a flock of contingent birds appear from nothing. You never see, or blue objects just appear together from nothing. No, whether there's one thing or infinitely many things, there's a deeper cause, a deeper explanation. So by logic, to avoid a circular cause, the cause of the contingent things can itself be contingent. It cannot itself be among the very contingent things. It's got to be something else. And so that's where we get to the conclusion of the first stage of the cosmological argument. There's got to be something that's not contingent, that provides the foundation for contingent things. And then by reason, this thing that's not contingent, remember by contingent, I said its existence, it could fail to exist. That's what I mean by contingent. So if it's not contingent, then it cannot fail to exist. Its existence is robust. It has necessary existence. That's how the argument works. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a kind of good overview on that part. But like, for example, if someone is becoming skeptical at this point and saying, but I'm still not convinced why we have to make that leap from contingent reality to necessary things, like Why can't just contingent reality, for instance, be an infinite chain of causes, or, for example, a circular explanation or something like that?
Good. Yeah. So this focuses on that third step. How do you go from contingent reality has a cause to the cause is not contingent? And I have two different things I want to say about this, and both of these are a matter of just clarifying. So the first thing I want to say is that the kind of cause that I'm interested in is what I might call an external cause. An external cause is something beyond the thing itself. So to kind of motivate this, imagine you're walking along in a forest and you discover a large purple sphere. So philosopher
Hmm.
Richard Taylor talks about this example. There's a sphere in the forest, and you wonder how it got there. Now, there's different hypotheses you can have to explain how it got there, right? So maybe this is government technology and the government is producing this. Maybe it's some kind of alien aircrafts, some kind of
Right.
spaceship that was produced, right? Now, somebody might say, well, you know what? Here's a hypothesis. Maybe it just got there without any cause at all. It just, if you were in the forest, you would see that this thing just appeared completely uncaused. Nothing produced it. Now, you might be sort of unsatisfied by that, but here's my point. If somebody said, you know what, actually, it does have some cause, but the cause is the very thing itself, we can explain its existence just in terms of that very thing. The worry that I have here is that you haven't really alleviated the deep question of like how it got there, like why it exists. Just by saying it a cause itself, well, why is there this self-causing reality? How did that get here? It's like, in order to really give a deeper answer, you want an external explanation. And this is the kind of explanation that we get in science when we're looking for an explanation of the fire, for example. It's not that the fire exists just because that very same fire exists. It's that fire exists because
Hmm.
of prior states. Even if it was, a fire that grows and expands, the idea is that there's prior states of reality that result in what we're seeing. And so I like to just stipulate that even if some kind of circular causation is possible in some sense, the kind of causation that this argument is focusing on is external causation, because reason and experience support the general hypothesis, the general expectation of an external explanation. So you're not going to have just an internal explanation. It's like if you want to know how did the ocean get there, ultimately, it's not that ocean that explains that. So we can apply this to reality as a whole. So that's the first thing. I'm going to stipulate external causes because I think that's how reason and science operate. And then second, and again, just allowing the possibility of circularity for sake of argument. We don't have to rule that out. Although if you press me, I think I probably would just rule that out. I think if you have a circular cause, you get a kind of contradiction because the thing has to exist sort of prior to making it exist. But if it exists
It's
prior to making it exist, it exists and not doesn't exist. You
it's
were going
it's
to say
like a
something.
mother giving. Yeah, I was saying it's like a mother giving birth to herself,
To
isn't it?
herself. Yeah, not to her
Yeah.
children, to herself. Or like a
Yeah.
chicken giving birth to that same chicken. It's like, yeah, there's something about that if that's really your best explanation of reality, well, I offer, I think, a better explanation that you don't have to appeal to circular causation. External causation is possible. Second, when we look at the possibility of an infinite number of things, I don't think that removes the call for an external explanation. I talk about this
Mm.
in the book, this book here, How Reason Can Lead to God. I talk about dominoes in an infinite chain. See, a lot of times people will make these arguments. There has to be a first domino. The argument from contingency, it doesn't require a first domino. Even if there's infinitely many dominoes, okay, you can still ask the question, how do those dominoes get there? Like, why are there those dominoes? Um,
Right.
why do any dominoes at all exist? Why not no dominoes? Um, if you have an infinite chain of dominoes, imagine you see all those dominoes are all knocked down in an infinite chain. And you say, they all got knocked down through infinite time, where each one was knocked by one before. Well, still, there's some kind of like table or floor or ground that holds
Right.
them up, right? And the ground is just as eternal as the dominoes. So I make the argument that to get an external explanation of contingent reality, we need something that's not itself contingent, no matter how old contingent reality is. Richard Taylor, no, I think it's William Rowe and Richard Taylor. I think both of them make this point in different contexts, that the mere age of a thing doesn't explain the existence of the thing, even if it's infinitely old. In fact, if it's infinitely old, your quest for an explanation might just increase. It's like, how could you exist that long for infinite time? Now, it might be that it exists that long because it can't not exist. It's not contingent. It has necessary existence. Well, great. That leads us to the conclusion of the first stage of the argument. There's a foundational reality that has necessary existence. That's how it exists that long. But if you have some contingent portion of reality and it exists forever and ever and ever, then I think there's got to be a deeper explanation of its existence. Maybe it depends on some deeper source which sustains the contingent reality, and the deeper source is not contingent. So that's part of what I would say there, is that if you have an external explanation, then just by logic, the explanation of the contingent realm in total has to be something else, something not contingent. And that logical argument does not depend on the quantity of the items or the age of the items.
Okay, brilliant. So we have ruled out a circular explanation, which is not possible, and an infinite chain, infinite regress is not possible. And you still briefly touched on.
Well, if I may interrupt here,
Yeah.
I'm allowing for the possibility of an infinite chain. I'm just saying, if the chain is infinite, it still needs that deeper explanation. Yeah. So it's not going to get us out of the argument. And same even for circular. I'll allow even for the possibility of a circular, although I do think it's impossible. But even if it is possible, that's not going to give us the external explanation that both reason and experience give us evidence of.
Right. So what I meant was basically that, it's not giving us a full explanation. There's some room there for a broader or deeper explanation. I meant that.
You got it. Yeah.
So the next point is, I'm still going on a very basic level because I want everyone to, catch up with where we are going.
Yeah.
So popular, these popular arguments, even though they don't stand, but, sometimes require some addressing. Some people might say that, but in physics, we know that, virtual particles come out of uncaused events. So maybe there is no explanation. How would we handle that?
Yeah. So this is the question about maybe exceptions to the causal principle. So just to review, I love what you're doing here, because we want to get very clear about what the argument is and does it withstand testing. So a great way to understand argument better is to subject it to tests. So objections are the instruments to test your argument. This is why I like to share my arguments with people and ask them to object to it. This is a great thing. So to review the argument, we had the first step was that something exists. The second step was that causal step, that something that's contingent is caused by something. And the third step was the logic step that goes from contingent things being caused to some foundational reality. As I think helpful to have this sort of visual reminder of the argument. So if this blue stuff is the contingent reality, and it's caused, the external cause is some kind of foundational reality. This is a necessary foundation that supports the existence of the contingent reality. Now what you're asking about is that second step, the step that every contingent reality has a cause, and you're pointing to some findings in science where it looks like maybe there's a counterexample. You've got these little particles that emerge completely uncaused, and science is sort of suggesting that if these things are small, these are the kind of things that could be uncaused, and maybe our universe emerged uncaused in the same way, so that you can actually have contingent things that are uncaused. Now, I have two responses to this objection, and I know you're familiar with these responses from reading the book, but just to review these for the audience. So the first response that I have is that I think to see truth, it helps to see how far you can explain something without having an arbitrary exception. So to illustrate this, if you want to understand that gravity works across different planets, even planets you haven't been to, you're not going to assume that that merely changing the planet or the shape of the planet is going to break the law of gravity, because unless you have some independent reason to think that differences in shape are relevant to the law of gravity, the law of gravity itself is a principle that's well supported. I mean, I would say the same thing with the principle of cause and effect. So unless you have some independent reason to think that the mere size of an object is relevant to whether it could be uncaused, our experience of things having a cause is evidence that things of any size, whether small or big, are going to have a cause. And I think reason supports this as well. I think that we can see just by light of reason that merely changing something to a smaller size is not going to make it able to exist uncaused. I mean, look, if you could get small things to exist uncaused, then that opens up the possibility that billions and billions and trillions of small things exist uncaused and flood into our existence. And that's going to have a macro level impact because all those small things are going to add up to some large, chaotic, uncaused reality. So that's on the side of reason. And then on the side of science, I want to just make a clarification, which is that there's nothing in science that shows that the virtual particles literally came from nothing. It's rather that there's no deterministic cause according to certain theories, that it's more that there's a probability that the particle emerges, certain probability that it doesn't, or that some other state happens. But it still comes from prior states. This is part of our scientific models, that there are prior states of energy and states of matter out of which these particles arise. So it's not really coming from nothing. So we don't have an exception there, which is great because I think reason itself testifies to the idea that there's not going to be an exception just by changing the size of the particle. So we have a nice uniform principle of cause and effect for big objects and for small objects, and we just leave open whether the causal connection there has to be deterministic or probabilistic.
Okay, that was a brilliant explanation. We went in quite depth regarding this because this is very popular. So this will help. Now, regarding objections, I'm not going to go with all of the objections that you highlight and then you explain how we can tackle those objections. Maybe like I'm going to look for some interesting ones. And also I want people to go through your book, which you just showed. And also, yeah, this is a very nice book. I recommend all of my viewers to watch it. To go through this book. And another on your YouTube channel, there's one video which is I think the course part 3, which is regarding the first part of the contingency argument, where you highlight 10 different objections. I think those are very important. People can see on the screen where all of these objections have been dealt with. And now just to two of them which were very interesting were regarding the infinite regress, which you went in quite depth. Because we are short for time, we're not going to go. One thing is, one interesting objection we can talk about is modal collapse. A necessary thing can only produce necessary effects. How would we tackle that?
Yeah. So first I want to get clear on, what's actually the problem here? Like what is the objection, right? So sometimes what people will do is they will identify an implication of an argument that seems to be implausible. So the worry here is that if you accept the contingency argument and it leads you to think that there's this kind of foundational reality that has necessary existence, it's not literally this block, but this block is it just represents a necessary thing. And you think, well, the necessary thing, in order to produce something, whatever it produces is supposed to be different in nature. It's supposed to be contingent. It's an argument from contingency that contingent things are caused by a necessary thing. But how does that work exactly? How can a necessary thing cause a contingent thing? And actually that objection from virtual particles helps us here, because the objection from virtual particles helps us to see that there are maybe two different ways that an effect could be caused. One way is by being 100% determined by the cause. The other is to be influenced probabilistically. So the cause is kind of a condition for the effect. And when the cause produces the effect, it doesn't mean the cause couldn't have instead chosen to produce a different effect. I say chosen because free choice is sort of a paradigm example where you have non-deterministic causation, at least on certain theories of choice. We have this concept of choosing one thing over another. Now, we don't have to say that the foundational reality chose the contingent reality, but that's an open possibility here. That's not ruled out by reason. And we're going to investigate the powers of the foundation later. We're going to see why I think there's good reason to think it would have a power to choose. But as far as the objection goes, reason doesn't rule out the following model. The foundational reality non-deterministically produced a contingent reality. See, so the reality is contingent because it's not deterministically produced by the necessary reality. The only way you get the modal collapse, that's the idea that everything has necessary existence, is if the necessary reality must, of necessity, produce only one reality, and there was no other options. Then everything's necessary. And you know, if everything's necessary, then that's just how things are. But if you think, I mean, because look, some people watching this, I know I have some friends who are okay with this view of reality. They think the foundation is necessary and everything that was produced is necessary. And if you're okay with this view of reality, then there's no objection here. But if you aren't okay with this view of reality because you think that there's some contingencies in reality, well, then you've got the model that I just provided, that necessary reality chose or non-deterministically caused contingent reality. And then there's no problem there. It's completely
Okay.
coherent. Reason doesn't rule that out at all.
And also, I think you've mentioned this in the first stage, our main goal is just talking about there is something necessary. And in the end, if someone is saying everything is necessary, even though, I mean, there's a problem there, but in the end, we're coming to the same conclusion, there is something necessary.
Good
right?
point. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, it's not really an objection to the first stage of the argument. That's right.
Right. So just last objection regarding the first stage that we are talking about is, but why think that the universe isn't a necessary thing? Maybe the universe is necessary.
Right. So this again helps us to think about the value of the second stage. So the first stage, just what you just said, is that there's some foundational reality that's necessary. And so if you think that the universe has that kind of necessary existence, that's consistent with the first stage. So it's not really an objection to the first stage. Now, it might turn into an objection to the second stage, but we have to look at that second stage first. When we look at the second stage, we'll look at reasons to think that foundational reality has a certain nature that allows it to be foundational. It's going to have non-arbitrary limits, and we'll talk about that. It's not going to have arbitrary shapes or limits in its core essence. And so if you think of the universe itself as having arbitrary limits, we'll look at why, limits have a further explanation. So the foundational reality is not going to be the kind of reality that has a further explanation. But that just means that this argument from the universe being necessary is an argument that invites us to look at the second stage. When we do that, we can investigate this question there.
Yeah. So maybe this is a question that can segue us into the second stage.
Absolutely.
And what I want, in this discussion is to be like a roadmap where all of your works are kind of highlighted here and there. So one small article you had on your website is also, can the ultimate cause be materials? Something along those lines, I think. That people can see on the screen, and that was also very insightful. So someone who wants to go a little more deeper into it, they can read what they can see on the screen. So yeah, so starting with the second stage. So what is now, how would we move forward from what we already established?
So I just want to say I love this project of investigating reality step by step, systematically. And this is a project for everyone. Like, no matter what your view is of reality, you can wonder, why does anything exist? I mean, whether you believe in God or you're an atheist, you can have that question. And there's an argument for that first conclusion, that there's some foundational bedrock reality that can explain why they're the non-foundational contingent things. And again, whether you believe in God or not, that result can be helpful for your worldview to understand that, okay, there's a causal structure to reality and there's a foundational explanation. And then wherever you're at, whatever your view is, you can wonder, well, what is the nature of this foundational reality? And can we even investigate this? Now, I want to just, before kind of talking about some tools for investigation, I want to just address a skeptical worry at this moment, because you might have this worry. Friends will sometimes raise this worry for me, that you can't really investigate this even in principle. Like, it's fundamental reality. This is the kind of thing that you can't look into. You can't observe fundamental reality with your eyes. It's too fundamental for that, right? It's too small or too deep or too, right, like far away from us to see it. it's not even the kind of thing you could see, right? So how can you investigate this? And then you say, well, maybe reason can help us. But the worry there is that, well, reason itself is too limited to investigate something as grand as the fundamental nature of reality. But at this moment, I want to just pose the question, like, how can you know that you can't know something about fundamental reality? How could you know that? In fact, if you could know that you can't know something about fundamental reality, then you would know at least this about fundamental reality. You would know that it can't be known. But that's to know something about it, namely that it's an unknowable reality. And how did you come to know that? I don't see how we can sort of know the limits of reason without actually just doing the investigation. And so that's part of what I'm doing here is I'm exploring what reason can find out. And this, I have a certain kind of excitement about it just from my own personal journey, is that the more that I shine the light of reason on things, the more that I discover I see more and more. There's more here. I'm not finding the limits of reason. It's not that it answers all my questions. I continue to have questions, but that it helps uncover more and more and more. And so we'll see how we can use reason to investigate, like, what kind of reality could be fundamental. And so this is what we're going to be doing kind of step by step. Now, in the book, I kind of divide the strategy into two different strategies. One strategy is to look at the effects in the world, like there exists complex creatures, there exists consciousness, there exists a kind of moral landscape, a kind of sense of right and wrong, for example. There exists mathematical truths and reasoning, our ability to discern mathematical truths. Those are all things that exist. And the foundational reality has to, in some way, give rise to those things because it's the foundation for all things. It gives rise to everything else. So there's a kind of argument, that strategy that we can look at that seeks an explanation of the things that we observe in reality in terms of the foundational reality. And then what kind of explanation is possible that actually explains everything. So that's one strategy. A second strategy that I love, and this is maybe my favorite strategy, is just to put the light of reason on the nature of the foundational reality directly and find out what things could in principle be foundational by carving off from the nature the kinds of things that I think reason reveals cannot be foundational, like turtles or colors. And we'll talk about why I think reason reveals that.
Yeah, you like turtles a lot, I believe.
Yeah, philosophers and turtles, they're a great example. And so then I think we can actually make some progress. But in order to see if we can make progress, we have to just do the experiment and try. You won't know if you can solve the Rubik's Cube until you actually just try and work on it and see if you can solve it. That's the way you test your powers.
Okay, so let's start with, so you gave us two ways of trying to have an analysis on the fundamental reality of the necessary thing. So let's start with the second one that you highlighted, which is trying to see why, for example, what if a turtle is the necessary foundation? Why not?
Yeah, right. So I have this turtle argument, and it helps to sort of think about theories that nobody believes, but it helps us to think about, like, why nobody believes these theories. And maybe there are different reasons. The goal is to sort of draw out a reason that provides a deep explanation why we don't think fundamental reality is produced by a turtle. Because, I mean, look, we could speculate. Maybe there's this great turtle that just gave birth to our universe, right? Well, I think that's not true. I think there are two witnesses against it being true. I think there's the witness of experience. So we don't have any examples of turtles that are able to exist in a necessary way. All the examples that we have of turtles are that they're contingent. And so remember, the conclusion of the first stage is there's a necessary foundational reality. And so I think this gives us evidence that the turtles, which through our experience are contingent realities, can't be the foundational necessary reality. So that's one kind of witness from experience. There's also a witness from reason. And I think here, the way that I think about it is just look at very clear cases. So if it's clearly the case that certain things with certain shapes, like a turtle, have been produced, okay, then ask yourself, is there a relevant difference between being a certain turtle right? Because maybe all the turtles that we've experienced have been produced, but there's a certain special turtle. It's just a little bit bigger. It has a certain, number of legs. Maybe it has 8 legs, it's just a certain kind of thing. And then if it's that number of legs, like that shape, then we can see that it has to be fundamental. Now, I think there's this general principle, call this principle of slight differences, that if X depends on something and Y is just slightly different from X, then we have good reason to expect Y to depend on something, because that slight difference is not revealing a relevant difference, right? We need some relevant difference to see why we're going to make the exception. And so this is the reason why I think that even if you have never seen where this blue object came from, you can be reasonably sure that this blue object is not the fundamental existence that produced everything else. You can be reasonably sure of that because you can see that this thing is not relevantly different from the things that have a cause in your experience. So a turtle has a certain shape, has a certain size, and I think you can actually see by reason. I have some conviction on this. I didn't always see this, but it happened one day. This was in grad school, and I was in the loft of the place that I was living, and I was thinking about cosmological arguments, and I was thinking about the prospect of an uncaused reality, and I started to think about the question of relevant differences, like what shape, what color would be relevant to make it uncaused. And as I was really thinking about that and going through examples, like the shape of a turtle, would it then be uncaused? There was something in my mind that I want to just say felt like sight, like clear intellectual sight, that mere differences in shape and size are clearly not relevant to explain the difference between being uncaused and being caused. And that there would need to be some explanation of that difference to understand why this shape has a cause and not this other. And so if that's right, then there's a kind of principle of uniformity that reason reveals, that things that are contingent are going to be caused, and that mere differences in shape and size aren't going to break this principle of causation. So that means that fundamental reality, if it's a necessary reality, it's not going to be contingent, and it's not going to have any particular shape or size like a turtle. And that's a reason to think that it is fundamentally not shaped. Fundamentally, it doesn't have a size. And by the way, this fits our latest physical theories. Many scientists I'm reading, physicists, are saying that space itself is not fundamental to reality, that there's a deeper explanation even of the spatial structures. And that fits well with the cosmological argument that any kind of spatial structure calls for a deeper explanation. It's a contingent reality. And so the necessary foundation can't be spatial in that sense. I can't have it. When I say spatial, I mean like finitely bounded, having a particular location or set of properties that are limited.
Yeah, interesting. I'm really enjoying this with you, by the way. So
me too. Thank you.
So moving on to maybe very briefly target, because I want to talk about so many things with you. So I want to get done with this one a
that
bit
sounds good.
Swiftly. So will that also be will that also entail that thing when we are talking about fundamental, which would not have like a specific, would not make sense to attribute a specific shape or a specific size, would also have to be eternal and unlimited in a sense?
Yes, absolutely. For the same reason, any limit in time would itself call for deeper explanation. Why does it exist for 10 minutes rather than 20 minutes?
Right.
If it exists for 10 minutes, then that means it began to exist, but then that means it's not a contingent reality. So, I'm sorry, that means it is a contingent reality, so isn't a fundamental reality.
Also, you mentioned one thing, which is anything that has to be necessary. You gave a broader definition of what necessary is, and that is it has to also exist. It cannot not exist in some timeline. It has to exist in all timeline, or maybe it has to be beyond time. So these are two possibilities, right?
Yes, and then they have to do with your theory of time. So I sort of divide and conquer, and I say, well, either you think time is dynamic or you think time is static, and I try to draw out on either theory. The notion of necessity that I'm working with is a strong necessity where it would exist no matter what time it is. It exists simpliciter no matter what time it is. And so, therefore, if it has necessary existence, then it can't come to be or cease to be. It's either timeless or exists across infinite time. One of those has to be true.
Okay.
Or it was timeless prior to the existence of time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, these are also like, topics that maybe if we get time, we can get into this also. So it has to be eternal. It has to also be, we spoke
Not
about, it
eternal,
has to be
not
ultimate.
shaped. Yep, fundamental, ultimate.
And so it has to be unlimited. So can we expand a little more on that? Like, no, it should not have any limits in the sense.
Yeah,
How?
again, so what is a limit? So I like to use the example of shape because the shape is an example of a limit. A limit is just some kind of boundary where logic doesn't preclude the possibility of something greater or lesser existing. And so again, going on the definition of contingency here, where it's what it is there is consistent with logic. It's consistent with logic that there's a larger turtle or a smaller turtle. This foundational reality, its essence is necessary, right? Because contingent things have a further cause. The foundational thing is not cause. So this is so important because it can help us to see by reason that it can't have anything within its fundamental essence, its fundamental nature, that implies that it is not what it is. What it is necessary. So it can't have features that are contingent, that are not necessary in its nature, which is why it can't have a particular shape. And I say it can't have any particular limit. Again, a limit is just some boundary, some property that where logic doesn't preclude more or less. You can't have that because those are contingent things. And so it can't have a certain contingent shape or contingent limit in power even. If it has a particular limit in power, that brings back the question, why does it have that power? If it could produce 25 snow cones and not 26, well, logic allows for the possibility of producing 26. So why does it only produce 25? If it's truly necessary, then it's not contingent. So it can't have the
Right.
contingent limits built into its nature.
So one clarification also, I think, because there's a very big uh, confusion going on generally with people. They think that if we make a case for God's existence using the contingency argument, then it necessitates divine simplicity. So can we address that it does not have to necessarily necessitate divine simplicity, and that we can have multiple attributes? Can you just
Right. Yeah. That doesn't require divine simplicity. I mean, it's a further question whether you want to sort of add to my arguments for divine simplicity. But my argument itself just completely leaves that open. You can have many, many different attributes that are distinct from each other, where those attributes themselves aren't limits, right? The idea is it's
Hmm.
limits that call for a further explanation. But there could be an essence here. I was thinking about this again today, just in preparation. There are some properties like having necessary existence that don't they're not like limits. There's not like a slight more or slight less, right? Remember
Yeah.
that slight difference principle doesn't apply. It's not like, slightly next to necessary existence is what? Necessary existence plus one? No, there's not that. And so it can have necessary existence in its nature. And that property, I mean, as far as my argument goes, could be different from the property of lacking limits, right? So it has the property of
Hmm.
lacking limits, the property of necessary existence. Both of those are in its nature. And you could debate whether those properties are distinct from each other. And so you don't have to believe in divine simplicity to think there is a fundamental essence that's unlimited.
Yeah. And then just one more point, which is what I think what you're trying to highlight here is that it can have multiple attributes, but those attributes have to be maximal. Those attributes cannot be limited in some.
That's right.
So
Absolutely.
maximal is. So also one more thing that directly entails from this is that the whole being has to be supreme in some way. Or how do we move from can we move from it being unlimited to being supreme?
Yeah, good. And I want to also clarify here that there are maybe two different ways that this essence, I'm using this again just to represent our necessary foundational reality, that is essence could lack limits. Two ways. So one way is that it has a feature like existence where it doesn't really make sense to talk about like, well, how much existence does it have? It's just, this existence is not the kind of thing that comes in degrees. Although, I mean, even that could be debated. But I mean, you could just think of some property where it doesn't come in degrees. Now, if it is the kind of thing that comes in degrees, then the idea is that it's not limited in some sort of arbitrary way. Instead, it's, as you said, it's max. I sort of think about this as a kind of categorical maximalness. So like if it has maximal power, it doesn't have power on a continuum of more or less. It has a kind of power that is without that continuum of more or less. It's got, like, let's say, all power, or complete power, or maximal power. And so this is a way in which the foundational reality is relevantly different from the realities that are contingent and have a further cause. Right? So it's maximal in its basic nature. Now you ask, well, why think it has a supreme nature if it has a maximal nature without limits? And my argument for this is just to simply add one more piece to the argument, which is that in order for this to be foundational to everything else, it has to have a certain kind of positive quality. And by positive quality, I mean a kind of quality that we would sort of intuitively think of as implying some kind of like value or greatness. So, if to illustrate this, if you're praising somebody, you say, I really like you, I think you're a great person. There are certain qualities that you might identify. Like, so you've got wisdom, you've got virtue, you've got knowledge, you've got power. You wouldn't say, I think you're a great person and you're very weak, you can't do anything. No, it's like there's something about the ability to do something good, the ability to create a world where there's good stuff in it, where there's powers and conscious beings in it, that itself has a kind of value to it. So I make an argument from different angles in the book that fundamental reality has a certain kind of power to produce things that have value. It can produce conscious reality, for example, like produce us. Then there's a value to that. So if it has that power, it has a certain kind of greatness. And then to avoid the problem of limits and boundaries being in the essence of fundamental reality, I deduce that the greatness of fundamental reality has to be maximal or supreme. And so this leads us to the conclusion that it has a supremely great nature. And that's what I mean by supreme being, is the kind of foundation that has a maximal great nature without limits or boundaries.
Okay, wow. So these topics are really like, unpacking takes a lot of time. We are almost about an hour done and we have covered up till now. The second part of this second stage. First part is still, maybe we can, if you can, unpack that a little. So there was one more thing you mentioned regarding the first part, is that we can also look at our reality and, try to look at that and then come to some conclusions about the fundamental reality. Yes. What would those things be? If you can unpack that for us.
Yes, let's do that. And just to kind of, again, give us the big picture of where we're at. There are two different ways you can investigate the nature of fundamental reality. And I think these two different ways point to the same conclusion in two different ways. So you can think of these as like independent lines of evidence that point to the same result. So there are people who make arguments for a supreme being just from observations of nature. And there are people who make arguments for a supreme being using the light of reason and using this principle of cause and effect that we've been looking at, shaving off arbitrary limits and seeing what remains. A supreme, purely perfect nature remains. And let me just say, by the way, sometimes people will worry that maybe there are some particular properties that are limits that could come out of the fundamental reality if that fundamental reality determines a limited nature. And the way this might look is that you have a fundamental reality that has an unlimited fundamental nature that determines certain limits, like the limit of a turtle. And I want to just clarify that I actually think that if the fundamental nature determined some particular limits, then it would be still arbitrary and confusing why it would determine those limits rather than other limits. So I think really to remove the arbitrariness of fundamental reality, to remove all contingency from fundamental reality, does imply that its fundamental nature is purely unlimited, in any attributes that nature determines will also not include particular limits and boundaries. And so this gives us a very robust, filled out, purely perfect foundation. And then that still leaves open the question of divine simplicity, as you pointed out. It leaves that wide open. So then we move into the second strategy.
So
Yeah, go
just
ahead,
one more
please.
thing.
Yes,
So what you mentioned, I think would raise some question, which is the fundamental reality would have to entail at least some contingency. For example, if the fundamental reality, we are open to the idea of the fundamental reality having a will or some volition or
that's it.
something indeterministic, then
Yes,
it has the ability to make contingent choices, for example. Wouldn't that be correct? So there
that's
would be
right.
some
Yes.
contingent. How would we explain that there is some contingency in the fundamental
Yeah. So the
reality?
contingency then occurs in the creation and not in its own nature. So the idea is that its contingency comes from, like you said, like a will or a choice or some kind of activity that's not deterministic. The thought that I was pointing to is that whatever's deterministic, whatever's determined, has to be
Hmm.
determined in a way that's consistent with that basic nature. And so you can't determine limits from the unlimited on this account. So it
Okay.
can't be that it's an unlimited fundamental reality that must deterministically be the shape of a turtle eternally, right? But this leaves open the possibility that it could create a turtle shape. It could even experience a turtle shape. All that's left open. The limits occur in creation, not in its own essence. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, and then there's just one more question, I mean, related
Yes.
to this, I think would clarify. For example, people like Ryan Mullins and stuff, I mean, and those people, they might also make a claim, which I just want to know your thoughts on, which is that there, for example, if we hold that view that being no, even though we are open to that fundamental reality either being completely timeless or being in or being in omnitemporal in all aspects of time, if we hold the view that is like that fundamental being is in time, that
Yes.
gives out some kind of contingency again, but wouldn't that shouldn't be a problem, right? For according to you?
I don't see that as a problem, at least not immediately. I mean, maybe there are some clever arguments behind the scenes here, but it's not really a problem on my view. I leave open its
Okay.
relationship to time. So it could be eternal in Ryan Mullins' sense of being across all infinite time, or it could be timeless, or maybe some kind of hybrid. It exists in time when time exists, and when there is no time, it exists timelessly. I leave all of that open. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean that involves a deeper discussion. Maybe we can I can call Ryan Mullins and have a discussion on that topic. But good that you clarified so that what you are like, the model that you are creating is open to all of these possibilities, different
That's it.
possibilities.
Yes. It supports lots of different views. It's consistent with all those different views, which is, I think, great because you could have all these different views and love this argument. This argument can
Right.
support your view. Yes.
A very irrelevant question comes to not even a question, a comment comes to my mind is I really like the 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 name that you have of your website, which is the worldview design itself.
Thank you.
That name itself is very creative in a way, which is where it kind of, to me, it gives the impression that you are working for like uh, on a design of worldviews, like how do we craft worldviews in the sense, which
Yes.
is fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's my purpose really, is to kind of help people become powerful, to see their powers, to design and develop their understanding of the nature of reality at the deepest level. If you can understand reality at the deepest, most fundamental level, that will give you insight into all the non-fundamental things, because the fundamental reality affects all the non-fundamental things. And so, yeah, that is, thank you for saying that. Yeah. My mission is to help people build out their view of reality.
Okay. So can we now
Let's do
briefly
it.
go into the first section of the second stage?
Yeah. So the
We are
second strategy here is to look at the effects that we observe. And in the book, and I have different things I've published on different of these things that we can look at, um, is to look at, okay, reality seems to include matter of a certain kind, the kind of matter that can turn into complex creatures. It seems to include also minds, conscious minds.
Hmm.
It seems to include a moral landscape. It seems to include a mathematical landscape of principles of mathematics. And so we can look at all four of those, and each one of those, I think, gives us independent reason to think that fundamental reality has certain kind of mental resources, some kind of power of intelligence, I think this is independently predicted if it's truly a supreme power that's going to include the power of intelligence. Because otherwise I think it would have some kind of like limit to its power that would call for deeper
Right.
explanation. So if it's truly a foundational reality, I think its power is going to be unlimited. It's going to include the powers of thinking. But also I think that if it has the powers of thinking, some kind of mental power, that will also give us a very deep explanation of the material world, the mental reality, the moral, the mathematical landscape, as well as the landscape of reasoning, and morals as well. So all of those landscapes, I think, are going to be better explained in terms of some fundamental mentality, and we can unpack that in each case if you'd like.
Okay. So you give a broad idea of when we just look at our world and we see different realities, for example, morals or matter itself or math
Yes,
itself. You
yes.
are saying that all of that, there has to be a deeper explanation for all of these realities, and that has to go back into to some explanation that the fundamental reality has to have for these things. So are you implying that this means that fundamental reality has to in some way have like in the sense ultimately supreme in those areas also, or what are you exactly saying? Like how would all of them uh like attach with the foundational reality?
I think each of these four that I mentioned that start with M, right? The math, the morals, the mind, and
Yeah.
the matter. Each of those, I think, points to the mental power of fundamental reality to explain why those things exist. So let's just look at matter, for example. Um, we can conceive of many different ways in which there's a material world. And let's think now of the material world as a world that occurs within some kind of spatial structure. So there's distances, there's sizes, there's some kind of spatial relationship between objects. Now we could imagine, we could conceive of a material reality where there's just one bit of material reality. It's completely stationary and that's it. Okay. And we could wonder, where does this come from? Why does this exist? Well,
Hmm.
the explanation of the contingent reality is going to be some kind of necessary reality that transcends the material contingent reality. That's fine. But my thought here is that what we find in the actual world is more specific than just a mere single stationary block. What we find is a world in which there are beings like us that have bodies and fingers and hands. And, how is it that there's a material world that has this kind of particular structure where there are life forms? And
Hmm.
physicists and philosophers have identified this familiar argument from fine tuning that the material world, it's not just given by reason that the material world is going to include life forms in it. And it turns out that in order to get a reality with life forms, the fundamental nature of the physical world has to be within narrow, sometimes called finely tuned boundaries or
Right.
parameters to allow for life to exist. And so this leads to a kind of probabilistic argument. The idea is that as a matter of probability, you're not going to expect there to be a high probability of life forms to exist if the fundamental reality is completely indifferent to the existence of life forms. If it's mindless or indifferent to life forms, the probability that there are life forms seems quite low. You wouldn't expect that. There's not a high probability. This has to do with how finely tuned the parameters have to be. I mean, just to give one example, there's the cosmological constant, which physicists say will measure the expansion rate of the universe. And it turns out that if that constant were slightly different by less than 1 part in 10 to the 50, just some very tiny fraction, then the universe would either expand too fast or contract in on itself too quickly for any kind of planets to form, for any kind of places for life forms to evolve. So it's not very likely that reality is going to be within that parameter just by chance or just by kind of mindless causes. But if fundamental reality has mental power, it has the power to intend a certain material
Hmm.
configuration, that increases the probability that the material world has life forms. And so that gives us evidence. Again, this isn't a proof, it's just evidence that if matter has certain material structure, life forms exist, that supports a kind of mind first theory that mind is embedded in the nature of fundamental reality.
Okay. That was a very good explanation. And I think this also opens the doorway to different arguments for God's existence, which
That's
kind of
it.
all
Yes.
come here again. And, we have space in our, to put many different arguments for God's existence here.
Yeah. So you're thinking of the contingency argument as, I would say, a kind of skeleton that can provide a backbone for other arguments. There's the argument from design, argument from morality for why there's a kind of mental explanation of moral structures. And we can look at each of those arguments carefully and then possible responses, etc. But I think it's helpful to even just kind of take a step back and think of the argument as kind of just an inference to the best explanation, that you have many different things that you can explain, but what is the simplest, most unifying explanation of all those different things, of matter, of mind? My latest book is just on explaining mind. How does mind exist?
Yeah.
And I lay out lots of different reasons to think that the deepest, most fundamental, simplest explanation of the different kinds of mental states that we see in the world is in terms of a foundational mind as well.
Right. So, and I was going to get to the mind part in the later part of our discussion, if we get the opportunity. One thing I really like about your approach is that whenever even if you establish something one way or two ways, that's not enough for you. You'll show so many creative different ways of trying to come to the same conclusion, and I really like that. So I want to know, when it comes to that foundation being supreme, that also implies that axiologically also that has to be supreme in one way, like in terms of
The
morals,
value. Yes.
in terms of value, it has to be supreme. So can you give me very briefly some arguments that, if you have to convince someone that this foundation is axiologically supreme, or for example this foundation is the whole, or it constitutes the foundation for morality, what kind of arguments can be used here?
So again, I'm kind of thinking of this part of the argument as more probabilistic. I know there are people who make arguments that are not probabilistic, that are kind of deductive, that if there are kind of moral standards, there's got to be some kind of ultimate anchor of those moral standards, and you can deduce a kind of foundational morality. But it's not that I'm against those arguments in principle. It's just that I find that you can make an argument just from probability. And I think that there's a certain kind of advantage. You can maybe appeal to more people that way, because you don't have to say, yeah, go ahead, please.
I know. I just wanted to say you always take a very modest approach, and
The modesty.
and I like that. I like that.
Yeah, because then you give people sort of the freedom to think about this, to kind of turn it over in their own minds. And you're saying, hey, here's some data. What's the best explanation of this data? Or even more modest than that, like, what's an explanation of this data? And then you can look at what's the simplest of the competing explanations. And so what I point out in the book there is that it looks like we have some kind of moral experience, a sense that some things are good or that some things are less good. And I even want to leave open whether that sense is tracking a kind of objective moral reality or a kind of subjective moral reality. There are different analyses of the moral reality. And again, for the sake of modesty and inclusivity, let me just say at least there's some kind of sense of good and bad, some kind of impression that things are good or things are not so good. Now I can ask myself, well, would a theory of fundamental reality as a kind of mindless reality, just particles, predict that there would emerge complex creatures that can actually have a not just consciousness, but a specific kind of consciousness, the kind of consciousness that can distinguish between a courageous event or a sort of virtuous engagement? No, there's nothing in the hypothesis that fundamental reality is mindless that gives any kind of positive prediction of that. But if instead fundamental reality is supreme in its nature, has maximal value, well, then I have some reason to think that this maximally valuable foundation would be interested in crafting a world in which there are all sorts of interesting experiences, including an experience where we can discern good states of affairs. I mean, that's the kind of thing I would sort of expect to emerge out of a fundamentally good reality. And you might say, well, what about bad state of affairs? How do they fit in? Well, the idea here is that maybe they can all fit into some kind of larger picture that's ultimately good if fundamental reality is good. At least this is open in principle. And so we make an argument from probability that if there are moral senses, these moral senses are more likely if fundamental reality has some kind of mentality than if it's completely mindless.
Okay.
And so that's
That was a
evidence.
bit
It's not a proof, but it's evidence here.
right, right. So now I think we covered a lot of ground, and I just want people to go through the bridge of reason. People can see on the screen the bridge of reason altogether. We start with existence. We have a puzzle. The puzzle is basically how do we make sense of contingent reality, and then is we get a necessary foundation. From foundation we move to eternal power. From eternal power we move to purely actual in one
Yes.
way. We don't have time to unpack all of that.
Well,
And then
purely
that
actual
leaves us
meaning it
with,
doesn't have those limits or boundaries in its nature.
yeah.
It's purely fundamentally maximal in its basic nature.
Okay. Brilliant. And from there, we move on to foundation of mind. You highlighted that.
Yes.
Foundation of matter. You highlighted that. Foundation of morals. Also, we got some idea. Foundation of math. Maybe we can. People can read the book and unpack that a
Sure.
little. Uh, there's then from foundation of math, you come to something known as reason. So, what can you briefly explain? What does that mean?
So reasoning, I'm thinking of sort of two sides of reason. There are these sort of abstract principles of reason that like 2 plus
Okay.
2 equals 4. That's an abstract
Hmm.
principle. And those principles seem to be true even if you aren't thinking about them. Like, because I could think that 2
Yeah.
plus 2 equals 4, even if you're not, right? So you don't have to
Right.
think that 2 plus 2 equals 4 for it to be a real principle. And then the other side of reasoning is our thinking about the truths and seeing that certain principles are true. And so I want to understand, why does reasoning exist? And why are there principles of reason that are true? What explains that? And here I offer again this kind of mind first or fundamental mentality is providing a deeper explanation of both the principles of reason, these sort of rules of reality that are in accordance with what must be. And I think that fits with this fundamental nature that must be, and this fundamental nature that must be grounds these principles that must be. And then how do we discern these principles? Well, I think here, if there's a foundational mind, it has reasons to produce a world with other minds that can learn and discover principles of reason. So this is where I think the mind first or fundamental mind hypothesis increases the probability that there is reasoning in the world. Whereas if you have, again, that mindless first theory, that fundamental reality is a mindless or indifferent reality, then you don't get that same kind of prediction that there would ever be any kind of reasoning that occurs in the world. You might have particles smashing each other, but you're not going to get reasoning. At least that's not
Right.
sort of predicted by the mindless first theory. So that's another reason. And again, all of these reasons to think that fundamental reality has a power of a mind are reasons that confirm what we already saw from the strategy that we looked at, where we looked at the reason to shave off arbitrary limits and boundaries. Those have a further explanation. So fundamental reality is not arbitrarily limited in its power. And so therefore it has the power to a maximal degree, which includes the power of intending on my account. So we've got lots of different evidence here that kind of points to one conclusion. There's a kind of mind at the foundation of reality that can explain the rest of the things that we see in a very deep way.
Wow. So one question I have, which is now in the start of the discussion, we spoke about, for example, something that was necessary. That, for instance, if you have two apples and you add two more, you get four apples. There is some necessary principle there, or there's something necessary there. How would we now? We are talking about a necessary being. What is the relation between some necessary facts or some necessary principle and the necessary being? How do you explain that?
It's a great question. Now, I would like to kind of leave things as open as I can and show how this sort of foundational theory fits with many different other theories. Um,
Right.
so, one idea called Platonism is the idea that there are
Hmm.
these sort of abstract principles that just exist eternally. And one proposal that I offer is that if Platonism is true, then we can think of these eternal principles as themselves existing within fundamental reality. So fundamental reality is itself eternal. It is itself a home for necessary truths to exist within it. Um, if
Hmm.
instead you're not a Platonist, you don't think that there are these eternally existing principles, well, then the idea is that these principles could occur within contingent thoughts or non-eternal thoughts, either in creatures or thoughts of the fundamental reality. Either way, the fundamental reality has the resources for thinking and producing the rest of reality. So I kind of just sort of leave that open and then just show how my theory fits with each of these theories. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but Alexander Proust and I were working on a book together called Perfect Existence. And Perfect
Hmm.
Existence will be kind of a sequel to our book, Necessary Existence. And in Perfect Existence, one of the things that we do there is we show how our theory of fundamental reality as a perfect fundamental reality fits together with different other theories. So these other theories aren't in competition with our theory. In fact, I would argue that our theory can provide a deeper understanding of these other theories. It can sort of illuminate the Platonist in a deeper way. We can see why there are all these abstract principles in terms of their integration into a
Right.
supreme foundation. They contribute, in a sense, or fill out the nature of a supreme foundation.
Right. In fact, that was one question I was going to ask you. I had noted it down that when is that book gonna come out? We are anticipating.
It's
Is
unknown
there any
yet,
date?
so we're still developing it. We don't yet have a contract date yet.
Okay.
So I'll let you know
Okay.
when I know. Yeah.
And that gives us a very good reason to also highlight your first book, which is Necessary Existence, which is also something I would recommend people to go if they want to go in depth regarding the topic, or the especially the first section of the argument that we were talking about, the first part in depth. I would really recommend that book. Moving on, one more question I have, which generally people ask me a lot, and this is where you keep this idea open. Which you mentioned about, maybe someone can believe in Platonism, or maybe conceptualism or nominalism, whatever that you are open to that view. I believe, as per what I have seen, you have moved away from, you personally have moved away from the
Yes.
Platonist view and moved more towards the nominalistic or the conceptualist view. Um, I myself,
Sort of.
I think,
Yes.
I also think that some sort of conceptualist view makes more sense than the Platonist view.
Yeah, that's my current view as well. Yes.
So one question I have is, then how do we make sense of God's relationship to logic? Like, can you give a very brief? Of course, you can't give a brief explanation. This requires a long explanation. But if you can give
Sure.
some comments on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this. So I'll give you kind of my present working hypothesis. And I want to just emphasize that my working hypothesis about God and logic and how they go together is independent from the argument, right? So
Okay.
it's an important point to me that the argument is sort of flexible in how it can be
Hmm.
combined with different views. But I'm continuing to think about this. So don't have all my thoughts completely worked out here. I mean, I'm still designing my worldview. This is my project, is to design my own worldview. So my latest thinking here is that, first of all, okay, there are some truths of logic. They're real. They exist.
Hmm.
And second of all, the existence of these truths of logic, these are principles of reason that you can see through reasoning, like that 2 + 2 = 4, or that if two people go onto a bus, then there's more than one person on that bus because two is larger than one. You could see
Hmm.
these things, right, in your mind. Um, but that their truth doesn't depend on you seeing them. Um, and that's a second point about logic, is that the truth of logic itself has a kind of necessity to it that's independent of its being seen by you. But then this leads
Hmm.
to kind of my third point, which has to do with its relationship to minds. So if logic holds, it's true, independent of you seeing it, then how is it that it exists if it depends on minds. So here I have a few different thoughts about it, but one thought, and I do talk about this in How Reason Can Lead to God, is that if you have a foundational mind, and that foundational
Hmm.
mind can ground the conceptual resources for logic itself. Okay. So that it can have a kind of necessity to it because the foundational mind itself has a kind of necessity to it. Now, one thing that I've been thinking about lately is how you could ground the necessary truths in a way that allows them to have a kind of contingency to them. It's a principle of logic that logic itself is necessary. But is there a way of understanding this necessity of logic so that even though logic is necessary, there's a contingency to it? And this is really on the edge of my current thinking.
Wow.
But I've been toying with the idea that there's a kind of necessity to it in the following respect. If it's thought, then it must correspond with reality. If it's thought, but it doesn't necessarily have to be thought. So like if 1 = 1 is thought, then the 1 = 1 will correspond to a reality of those numbers, even if you don't have to think 1 = 1. And so I've been kind of working that out and kind of turning over some previous structures in my mind, elements of my worldview, kind of reorganizing some things here to sort of allow for that, because of some of the reasons that I started to move away from Platonism has to do with some sort of paradoxes with the propositions all just being out there necessarily in existence. But if they're not out there necessarily in existence, then in what sense is logic necessary? And I'm thinking it's something like what I just said, that it's necessary that if you think it, it's going to correspond with reality. And so that's going to retain the necessity, even if it doesn't have to be thought. You don't have to think. I mean, just to use kind of a silly example, necessarily, if there are 45 pine cones sitting on 12 unicorns, then there's more than 2 unicorns. Okay, that's true, and it's necessarily true. But it's kind of weird to think that that necessary truth like exists even without unicorns, even without pine cones. Oh, well,
Hmm.
of course it exists without unicorns, but like even without thinking about unicorns, even without thinking about pine cones. And do you have to necessarily think about those things for it to be true? So this is why I'm thinking, well, at least it's necessary in this way. Necessarily, if you think it, then it's true. So at least has that kind of necessity to it. So that's, I'm toying with that idea. And then that just sort of allows me to still think that logic exists. Logic doesn't depend on me thinking about it. There's still some kind of necessity to it. But the existence of the propositions depend more fundamentally on thoughts that occur within minds. And so this allows the foundational mind to produce thoughts, our minds to produce thoughts, and it sort of leaves open the sort of status of those thoughts. If they have a necessary nature, then that's because they would be true if they're thought, if that makes sense.
Okay. So one conclusion at least we can derive is that we can still establish the necessity of logic without and ground it,
Yes,
even if we have a non-Platonist view in
that's
some way.
right. Yes, you don't need a
Okay.
Platonism to have some sense in which there's a necessity to logic. I think you
Okay.
can account for that. Yes.
Now, and even morality and other things, right?
Yes. I mean, more fundamentally, as long as you have a necessary mind, that necessary mind can ground. I mean, if you think that these things require a mind and there's a kind of necessity to them, then that just means the
Yeah.
mind itself is necessary. That's an argument that I make in the book, and that's certainly an argument to explore. My most recent thoughts kind of leave that part open, right? Because I'm
Okay.
thinking that even the necessity of logic doesn't necessarily require the necessary existence of the propositions. There's a way of understanding the necessity without the necessary existence. This is an update. I haven't really talked as much about this update. This is like within the last year or so. But if you think that the necessity of logic requires necessary existence, and you think that it depends on a mind, as I do, then that fits very well with the necessarily existing mind. So it would just be one more reason to think that fundamental reality has a necessarily existing mind. That fits perfectly with that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So that was brilliant. That clears many questions that I personally had. Uh, so we have covered a lot of ground, and if we go back to the bridge of reason, we are, I think, on the last part, which is the treasure. So before we move into treasure, like one question I want to ask, and also a comment, which is, have we established God's existence now? Because some people say that, oh, you can we like we can believe in aspects of necessity and still won't believe that it leads you to believe in God's existence.
Maybe it
And
depends on what you mean by God at this point, right?
exactly.
But we get a treasure, right? Because what we get here is a foundational reality that has a lot of sort of classic divine attributes. It has eternal existence, because if it began to exist, then it would have a contingent nature. So it would be the ultimate fundamental explanation of contingent things. So instead, it actually has an eternal nature. It has an independent nature. It exists independent of prior things. It's not the shape of a turtle. It's not the shape of a squid. It's not any shape. In fact, it's shapeless most fundamentally. It doesn't. It's not blue or red. Despite my example here, it's not actually red. The fundamental reality can't be red, because if it were red, then that itself would require a deeper explanation. Why is it red rather than blue? But fundamental reality
Right.
is the deepest explanation. So it can't have colors. It's colorless. It's, in that sense, it's immaterial. It doesn't have particular place in space. It's prior to spatial structures. Also has a kind of mental power to explain many of the different things that we see, that in terms of math and mind and morality and the particular material configurations. Also, it has a kind of non-limited power. Again, because if it has no fundamental limits, then its power its ability to produce things would have to be non-limited. And this is an independent reason to think that I think it has powers of thinking to avoid the limit in power. So it can do all these things, and now you want to know, like, well, should we call this God? Well, I mean, here's a hypothesis. It is a supreme being that would explain why it doesn't have limits, why it has all these powers, why it has these resources to ground everything else. And if it's a supreme being, that's just like kind of what I mean by God. And I love
Yeah.
this result because it allows us to think about God independent from religion. It doesn't exclude religion by any means. It can fit within religion, but it doesn't require religion in order to investigate this. People from different cultures can come together from different perspectives and say, hey, it looks like fundamental reality has a supreme nature. And so we can be united in that vision of fundamental reality. Like, I have this sort of dream of people across all the different cultures coming to celebrate this common ground, that there's a fundamental reality and it's supreme. And, what else can we learn about it? Has it entered our world? Has it revealed itself in certain ways? What else can we find out? Great. We can keep debating that. I mean, we can keep debating whether this thing is real. Of course, all the debates can stay alive, but the idea that we could, across many different perspectives, come to see fundamental reality as having this unified, fundamental, supreme nature is, I think, a beautiful thing. You don't need to figure out what religion is true first in order to see that there are these reasons to think that God is real in this sense.
Yeah, that's again brilliant, that the light of reason has, like, up till now got us till this stage, which is coming to the treasure. Now at least this can make a person, this at least should actually satisfy the minimalistic definition of God. And a person, if he's followed us through at this point, we can at least call him a theist. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So now maybe if you have established theism somehow, maybe we can broaden the definition to talking more about theism. So one thing that I want you to highlight a bit about is one of your discussions, and whatever I found interesting regarding what you have said about theism, I've kind of laid it down, and I might ask you regarding that. So
Great.
on one of your discussion on YouTube's, I think it was Intellectual Catholicism, I think that was the name of the channel. I can the host was asking you that Robert Kuhns, for example, says that theism is the most simple, comprehensive, unified explanation. And would you agree? And you said yes, that is something everyone has to agree
Yes.
to sorry or everyone has to agree to that it is the most simple, comprehensive, unified explanation, and it is so it's something along those lines. You said that it is explanatory power is so good to the point where it makes people predict every aspect of reality. Can you very briefly expand on that a little?
Well, I think so. You might need to help me out a little bit to kind of help me know exactly what you're thinking, because one issue has to do with the problem of evil. If this is what you're
Yeah,
worried about, that it's such a powerful, yeah, because I do remember saying it's such a powerful hypothesis.
yeah.
It's so explanatorily fruitful. It can help explain and illuminate why there's a material world, why the material world includes creatures, why there's a sense of right and wrong, all these things. It's so fruitful that you might think that really the problem with theism is that it's too fruitful. It actually predicts too
Mm,
much. It's not that it doesn't predict enough. It predicts that reality has to unfold according to fundamental goodness. And you might think that if reality has to unfold according to fundamental goodness, right? Because the fundamental reality has supreme value, and supreme value implies a good nature. If it's not good, then it has some kind of defect or detraction from goodness, which is going to, I think, imply some kind of limit or boundary that would call for further explanation. And so if it's really fundamentally good, then why are there bad things that happen in the world? That's a deep question. Why isn't all of reality purely perfect? Now, why don't you just have a completely, purely perfect experience forever and ever and ever and ever? That's a question. And part of my answer here is to say, well,